Welcome to the rise and fall of the British National Party. I joined the BNP on the 20th of January 1990 at Ilkeston in Derbyshire on the recommendation of Ian Stewart, who I knew briefly. I had several discussions with, and I told him that his brand of nationalism wasn't for me, that it was simply far too radical and would never gain traction with the masses. He recommended that I join the BNP because it was more in keeping with the moderate position that I wanted to adopt to push forward the cause of nationalism. Although I admit I was young and inexperienced at that time, and he was far more experienced, obviously. And so I went ahead. I spoke to Carl Brown, who was recruiting for the BNP. He showed me a leaflet. I read it and I thought, yeah, that's absolutely for me, you know. Stop immigration, start repatriation, leave the EEC, withdraw from NATO, and adopt a position of armed neutrality. You know, these were all things that I supported. They were close to my heart, in actual fact. And so I joined up. I gave him my £10 membership fee, and the rest is history. Well, it will be after I finish making this this documentary about the rise and fall of the BNP. So I knew very little about the BNP at that time, and was largely inactive for the first few weeks until September 1990, when I became much more active, having cleared some legal and business issues out of the way. And I had my own construction business at the time. I employed 11 men. And I was also the Northwest Knots organizer, and yeah, I very quickly, within a few months, came up with a raft of new ideas, and I presented them to the East Midlands organizer, as he was at that time, John Peacock, that we unite the whole of the Midlands under one central command, under his leadership, of course. And that included fundraising and campaigning. The West Midlands was in an absolutely dire state, quite frankly. The East Midlands was much more organised and had far more members and activists. The West Midlands was lagging behind quite seriously because of a man called Keith Axon, quite frankly, who was incompetent. And the more I got to know Keith Axon, the more incompetent I realised he was over the years. In fact, he's with the Heritage and Destiny crowd at this moment in time. Well, you know, I'll come to Heritage and Destiny later, but Keith Axon, my goodness, you know, I wouldn't follow him to the corner shop, and didn't, quite frankly. So when we united the entire Midlands under one command, Peacock made me the Midlands Elections Officer. I was tasked specifically with winning elections for the British National Party, or improving our share of the vote, which was a very difficult task. You know, we had no big business behind us, despite the ridiculous lies of the far left saying that we were all supported by the corporations. Well, I never saw a penny of any money from the corporations, and I'm not aware that anyone else did as well, in actual fact. In fact, later on in the story, I'll reach an incident in November 1993 where a very substantial sum of money that could have been donated to the BNP was stopped, in actual fact, from the United States. And it certainly wasn't from a corporation, certainly not a corporation as you'd understand it. But going back to the original essence of where it all began, John Peacock, well, I mean, many people had severe criticisms of him, in actual fact. He seemed to attract criticism over his own incompetence. But the simple truth is, Peacock kept at it, you know. He was a stalwart. He was a Tyndall loyalist. His drive was undeniable. His stubbornness and determination, admirable, in actual fact. Yes, strategically, he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box, quite frankly. And things had to change, and it was very difficult trying to change anything in the BNP at that time. Attempting to modernise the party, even at the local level, could be an uphill struggle at that time. So I just basically took the view that it didn't really matter what Peacock wanted. I'd just go ahead and pretty much do whatever I wanted, and then just tell him about it later, once we'd had some form of success. And of course, this included the the formation of direct action units. And the reason why the direct action units were formed was purely because of left-wing violence, which was increasingly extreme across the entire country. And after Tyndall and his wife were attacked by Red Action, who were a hardcore, fanatical communist group, a decision was made that we had to do something to protect BNP meetings. Every BNP meeting in the country was at risk of being attacked. Wherever we tried to organise, the far left would turn up to attack it, or try to attack it. In many cases, they were very successful. And the BNP, quite frankly, at the beginning of 1991, was teetering on the brink of collapse. So we faced a dilemma that we either formed our own stewarding groups, which is what they were officially known as, or disband, because there was no point in trying to continue to contest an election of any description whilst being stalked and hunted by far-left fanatics, hell-bent on violence. And that is the truth of the matter. Forget all the nonsense in the media. One thing this documentary is here to do is to totally shatter media myths about the British National Party. I'm not here to launch a scathing attack on the BNP. I'm here to give the most fair and honest, balanced criticism that I possibly can, having held several senior positions in the BNP. And so therefore, I think I'm qualified to discuss this matter, quite frankly. And so a decision was made that we would form stewarding groups and we'd take the fight to the far left, although that wasn't the policy nationally. No, that was a policy we decided at West Bridgford in Nottingham in 1991. I decided that we would literally form a direct action unit, and I would remain as the elections officer for the whole of the Midlands, tasked primarily with contesting elections, organising elections and raising the funds to fight those elections. That was my job. But behind the scenes, obviously, other things were happening. We had a direct action unit, and that was put to work dealing with the far left, ensuring that they weren't able to stop us from organising electorally, and that we could carry out our rights under the Representation of the People Act without fear of being molested or kidnapped, for want of a better description, by the far left, which did happen once, in actual fact, at Long Eaton in Derbyshire. The entire BNP canvassing team was kidnapped, taken off the streets by a far left terrorist group, for want of a better description, held hostage in a house until Derbyshire police came along and negotiated their release, and none of the leftists were actually arrested. They simply said, we did this as a protest against so-called fascism, and the police swallowed it. Well, the senior commanders did anyway. Absolutely disgraceful. The following weekend, I was back on duty, and the Reds, that's what we called them, the Reds, okay? So let that sink into the parlance right now. We called them the Reds. They came out again thinking that they were going to kidnap us, and they took one of my men and ragdolled him, threw him all over the street. He was about 5 foot nothing, in actual fact, light as a feather, not a street fighter of any description. And of course I was a senior officer on the ground, so I had to go around the corner and resolve the issue definitively. And no further kidnappings ever took place in Long Eaton or anywhere else ever again. That matter was resolved very professionally, and yeah, of course it was done so at some considerable risk to me, to my physical welfare and also my liberty. But that's just the way it is, or the way it was in the BNP in those days. It was impossible to organise an election campaign without running the risk of being violently attacked at any moment in time, even in your own home. The left did not shy away from attacking nationalists in their own homes, and that could include anything. I mean, obviously I can't be far too graphic because of the YouTube algorithm, but they were extremely violent. They were wholly committed to violence. They did not contest elections. They had no purpose, no presence whatsoever at the ballot box. Their only objective was violence, intimidation, threat, and a litany of dishonest articles about the BNP and the people in it. And so that solution that we came up with to form stewarding groups was a solution in actual fact. But ultimately it was to lead us down a road whereby the stewarding group formed in London, led by Charlie Sargent, and I'm sure his name will raise hackles in a whole raft of quarters in actual fact. Certainly does in my own, to be honest with you, thinking back on it. You know, there was never an intention to create an organisation called Combat 18. That is what it became later, shortly before the Great Schism that led to the Civil War in the BNP, effectively in 1994, when the NS crowd had to leave because John Tyndall and Richard Edmonds and a number of others, the Tyndall loyalists, did not want the BNP to adopt an openly National Socialist agenda because it could never succeed, and we didn't want it and we didn't believe in it. And I was in that faction. I wasn't a Tyndall loyalist by that time in actual fact, but yes, the NS crowd had to go their own way, and they did, under Sargent, and the rest is history with him as well. In actual fact, he ended up doing life for murdering one of his own men in an argument over finance, as usual. You know, money, the root of all evil, and that business. But going back to Tyndall, you know, I used to write to him on a frequent basis, and I read Spearhead magazine and the British Nationalist, and I wanted to be published. I wanted to write my own articles. I had a number of ideas, and so I designed a raft of new leaflets, and I actually did so with a typewriter and a letter set and photographs that had been lifted out of books or newspapers, and put them all together with Pritt stick, and then flattened them out and photocopied them. And sometimes I had it done in colour, which was very expensive in those days. And then I sent them off to head office, and they accepted all of them. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted. Like, wow, fantastic, you know. I'm no longer the ground worker, or just a ground worker. You see, I worked in construction as a ground worker, and even though I had my own business, employing 11 men, you know, these snobs there never let you forget that you're just a ground worker. That's all you are. You can never be anything else. You're just a ground worker. I had other ideas. I was never just a ground worker. I was destined for something far bigger and better than being a ground worker. Not that I look down my nose at anybody who is a ground worker in actual fact. I did it myself for nearly 10 years. You know, it's a good, decent job. When you're not facing the prospect of paying bribes to a bunch of crooks who have turned construction basically into an organised crime factory, which is the reason, one of the main reasons why I actually pulled out of construction, because I refused to pay bribes. And obviously I don't accept bribes because I'm not corrupt. And it was a common problem wherever I went in construction, you know, as an employer, you know, subcontractor. Practically everyone met wanted a bribe. Site agents, clerk of works, contracts managers. My goodness, it was absolutely sickening. Truly it was. And so I was faced with a decision. You know, I either put everything into my construction business and try and become a multi-millionaire, which is what my girlfriend at the time wanted me to be, because, you know, all she was obsessed with was the material aspects of life, quite frankly. And or throw everything into, you know, my life in the BNP, which really meant the end of that relationship, because, you know, while she was a Conservative voter, she certainly wasn't of the BNP standard, and her family weren't, and no one in my family supported the BNP in actual fact as well, until many years later when some of them did actually vote for the BNP, long after I'd left, that is, and which was quite amusing for me, very ironic, and or even poetic justice in actual fact. But that said, I made the decision, okay, I'm going to throw everything into, you know, my career in the BNP. I believed in the party. I believed in Mr. Tyndall. And in the correspondence I exchanged with him, you know, he said that he believed in me. He saw my talent. I wasn't just a ground worker to Mr. Tyndall. I wasn't a piece of dirt beneath his boot, you know. He wanted to transform me into a professional writer. And he said, but you need to be cleaned up. And I agreed. Yeah, I did need to be cleaned up. You know, I had to clean up my act, as it were. I had to learn how to write properly at a professional level. And he said to me, you know, send me your articles in raw form and I will paraphrase them, rewrite them, edit them, and publish them under your name without any indication that I've done this. And I will then teach you in the process of doing this how to write, and you will learn from what I do. And then you'll be able to send me articles that are much more professionally written, which is exactly what happened. So, you know, the 11 books that I've written since then, I credit all of them to John Hutchins Tyndall, in actual fact. The fact that we later, you know, didn't see eye to eye on a number of things is completely immaterial. I'm not here to denigrate and besmirch the reputation of John Tyndall at all. You know, the man had many good points and he had many failings as well. All of us do. And anyone who says they don't is just not being honest. They're just not living in the real world, quite frankly. And so, really, that's how it began for me. That's where I started climbing the ladder. But once I got to Midlands Elections Officer, there wasn't really anywhere else I could go other than National Organiser or National Elections Officer. And in all honesty, Richard Edmonds was the National Activities Organiser. I had no chance of replacing him. He was thoroughly good at what he did and very well respected in the party. So, you know, toppling him was almost impossible. Tyndall said he would train me as a protege, as a future leader, but obviously that would be many years into the future. And like I think nearly all young men, I was very impatient and wanted to advance beyond my years, as it were. And so really, Eddie Butler was also very impressive as the National Elections Officer. And so replacing him, you know, was going to be a very difficult task as well. And so I realized that I was going to be stuck as the Midlands Elections Officer for quite some time unless something else came up on a national level. So I committed myself to the Midlands area. I raised, you know, several £1,000s just from members alone. No big businesses, no corporations backing us. Just by sending out letters, you know, with a second-class stamp attached to it, asking people if they could donate to the party to finance our election campaigns. And back in those days, raising over £7,000 just from sending out a few letters, and I was told at the time it wouldn't work by John Peacock. Oh yeah, we've tried this before, it didn't work. Well, it certainly worked when I tried it. I can tell you that for a fact, you know. I guess it's about how you phrase these things. And I phrased it correctly, and found the right track, obviously, and the money came in. And of course, whenever there's money around, you get these jealous, greedy eyes. People who aren't really committed to the nationalist cause at all, in actual fact. They just see the money and think, my goodness, you know, there's free money here. There's free money on offer. Maybe I can get a bit of this. To hell with the cause, you know. Maybe I can get some free money from the free money tree. Well, not while I was around. And in all the years I was in the British National Party, 7 years in total, in 2 phases, never once was I paid a penny for any work that I did for the party, anywhere. And I did no grifting as well of any description. The only money that I raised went to the party and was to be used for the party alone, in actual fact. But, yeah, I mean, look, it was, you know, a very violent time. There's no point trying to pretend otherwise. You know, I've been on many activities across the country where there's been serious violence with the far left. And the reason why I say serious violence with the far left is because they brought that violence to us. And that was their policy. Remember, and I reiterate, these people did not contest elections. They were not an electoral force. They were not trying to be an electoral force. They were just a gang of thugs, quite frankly, ideologically brainwashed thugs, particularly Red Action and Class War, looking for violence, looking for aggro. And Red Action were extremely violent. And the only way to stop them was with brute force, quite frankly. And whilst that was unpleasant, what alternative was there? Who else was going to do it? Perhaps the, you know, a divine messenger was going to fall from the heavens and with a magic wand and just sweep them all away into the gutter of history? I think not. And that's never been the case throughout history, in actual fact. And so, yes, we had to use direct action to stop their direct action. And that's exactly what we did. And it led to a number of very violent incidents across the country because we wouldn't back down to them. And, you know, there's a whole litany of photographs out there, and in some cases, video footage as well, in actual fact. Not very good quality. This is days before smartphones and the 4K cameras that we have today. But, yeah, I mean, I was on Brick Lane many times with the BNP, and a couple of, well, 2 or 3 times it actually turned, you know, very nasty because of the left. And on one occasion in November 1992, Red Action sent their full detachment to Bethnal Green, and they waited for us to come off the actual demonstration itself. There were about 2,000 of us. The left were actually stunned that we were 2,000 strong. We had more than what they did. They usually outnumbered us, and the first time they turned up to face us outnumbering them, they were stunned. So Red Action, of course, they waited for our main detachment to peel off. And then we went to a public house about a quarter of a mile away from Brick Lane, and Red Action attacked it. And, you know, it was a freezing cold November morning, foggy, probably about 5 below, something like really, really cold day. And a pitched battle ensued, which was the defining moment of the BNP's war with Red Action. Because what happened was Red Action got totally and utterly destroyed very badly. In fact, as we came towards the end of the battle, and I remember it vividly, I heard police sirens, you know, probably half a mile away. And I looked down the road, and there was, I think there was 11, you know, TSGs, tactical support groups, riot police, en route. And so obviously we evaded the scene very quickly, having done the job, having done the business. And in all honesty, most of them had come from Manchester, and they got a very, very severe lesson to take back to Manchester with them. And I think over 30 of our men were arrested on public order offences, and some of the Red Action lot were. In fact, one Red Action guy from Manchester was arrested, and he had over 40 convictions for public order offences. You know, this is the measure of what you're dealing with. Me, I had no convictions of any description for public order, you know, and not even a caution, quite frankly. You know, I was clean as a whistle. And, you know, so this is what we're dealing with. And these people were extremely violent. They are ideologically, fanatically committed to communism. And they're also involved with IRA active service units. And later, after the November 1992 incident, when they failed completely, they started sending BNP members letter bombs, some of which detonated, causing very serious injuries. So look, this is not a game we're talking about. This is a war, okay? This was a war. Let's be totally honest about that. You know, the British National Party was a political party, but by early 1993, I realized that in actual fact, I was in a hybrid political party paramilitary organization. And the reason why that happened was because of groups like Red Action and Class War, Anti-Fascist Action, ANL. ANL were all Socialist Workers' Party. Goodness, they were pipe grease. They were pathetic, useless. You know, we could go through them like a hot knife through butter, forgive the pun. It was easy. They were no match for us at all. Red Action were more of a match, but yeah, they got their comeuppance in the end. And so eventually what happened was, because the left got so many lessons at the hands of the BNP's direct action units and C-18, is that they had to go and hide behind police lines. Probably a good decision in actual fact, considering the amount of times they'd had these lessons. and I think they'd become tired of being taught lessons. But the lessons they were being taught was the lessons that they'd taught us in the first place. We were simply throwing their lessons back at them, and they deserved it, quite frankly. Their objective was to stop the BNP from organising everywhere using violence, and ultimately they failed because we used force to stop them. Was it the right policy or the wrong policy? Well, in retrospect, I fail to see how it could have been done differently at that time. I've heard many people speak about this in the years since, saying it was wrong, we became like a street gang, we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have done that. Get real, please, get real. I was a Midlands Elections Officer. I was tasked with organising elections, and I can tell you for a fact, in Derbyshire in particular, where I operated most, organising an election and contesting it without being subjected to left-wing violence was absolutely impossible. What was I supposed to do? Ignore it? Let them do whatever they wanted? That's not in my nature, never has been, never will be. I wasn't brought up that way. My father raised me to fight back, and he was a communist. Oddly enough, he failed to transform me into a communist. He also failed to turn me into a Labour MP, which is what he had in mind for me. Thank goodness that never happened. Not the way he saw it, obviously, but that's just the way it is. All sons are born to disappoint their fathers, aren't they? And live their own lives, ultimately, quite frankly. Look, I'm not the type of person who will allow anyone to push me around, and I fought back. And that's how I was able to organise BNP election campaigns as an elections officer. In fact, there was a notorious incident. It's just over there in the background, about near the horizon, where the finger's pointed, about 3, nearly 4 miles away, a place called Copmanay in Derbyshire. And so in summer 1993, there was this incident called the Battle of Copmanay, which I was given the blame for, obviously. Who else could be to blame other than Simon? So what happened was, quite frankly, we were contesting the local elections. Our candidate was a chap called John Leather from Alfreton in Derbyshire. And yes, well, we'd organised a meeting at the Hand and Heart Public House, at which Richard Edmonds, the national organiser, was going to speak. And we were actually in the Hand and Heart with Mike, the landlord, when hundreds of far left activists came marching up the street with their placards and wooden sticks, which they used as weapons, which is the whole reason why they had those little placards on those wooden sticks, so they could convert them into using a weapon. In other words, clunk you around the head and the face with it. So you had to be very wise to that and get in first and make sure they didn't do any damage. And so what happened was, the landlord then cancelled the meeting, said he couldn't go ahead with it because he feared they were going to smash the pub up, because that's the threat he'd already received. So this is the far left we're dealing with. This is the type of violence we're talking about, okay? This is not the BNP that's threatening anyone with violence. It was the far left. So they cancelled the meeting. This absolutely infuriated the local men. Now, Copmanay is a hardcore place, then and now. More so then than it is now. And, Richard Edmonds actually turned up with his driver from London, and I told him what was happening and what was going to happen, to the best of my knowledge. And he said, I order you to order those men not to do anything. This is going to look really bad for the party. I mean, it was very rich in actual fact coming from Richard Edmonds, because the first time I ever met him at Welling in Kent, he actually ordered us to do a hard intervention on a group of far left thugs heading to the BNP's bookshop, and stop them from getting there, which is exactly what we did. I mean, obviously you can understand what hard intervention means. Well, yes, they certainly understood it, because they never got anywhere near the BNP bookshop that day. And then here he was 3 years later telling me not to do a hard intervention in Copmanay. Well, quite frankly, I had no choice in the matter at all, truthfully. It was going to happen irrespective of what I said. And because it had already been determined by the guy on the ground, Trev Wade, who was actually pretty much the unofficial leader of the local men. and I worked with him very closely, and I went back to the Working Men's Club and I told him what Richard Edmonds had said, and in no uncertain terms, you know, I won't repeat the words that he used. He made it quite clear that they were going in. You know, the Reds had formed up in the centre of Copmanay. In actual fact, they thought they could come in from Nottingham, which is where they'd been shipped in from, and lay down the law to the local people in Copmanay. That was a big mistake, very, very big mistake, and it was always going to end that way. If the far left hadn't have turned up and done what they did, if they just stuck to their demonstration in Ilkeston town centre, this would never have happened. But they just decided they had to go down into Copmanay looking for trouble, which is one of the biggest mistakes you could ever make. And that's what they did. They went down into Copmanay looking for trouble, and they got trouble, big time, big trouble. You know, they got absolutely trashed, quite frankly, in the centre of Copmanay. They were surrounded by hundreds of BNP supporters, and it could have been a lot more serious in actual fact, but those aspects of it I did manage to curtail because it wasn't necessary. We weren't facing that type of force or that threat from the left. And so I left the scene, and about 30 of our men were arrested. They were refused charge, obviously, simply because the coppers at Ilkeston police station, nearly all of them supported the BNP, particularly our Hang Child Murderers campaign. And that's the way it was back then. This is before they were brainwashed by common purpose, aka Marxism today, this hideously left-wing police service in inverted commas that we have today. I don't care what they think. I'm not interested. End of. That really is a fact. They need to let that sink in at Derbyshire, please. I don't care what any of them think. None of their intimidation has ever had any effect on me, and it's never going to. I tell it the way it is, and they don't like it, no problem. Go and apply for a criminal behaviour order. I'm sure some bent magistrate or some bent activist judge would be only too happy to give it to them. But that's the way it happened. That's the way it went down in Copmanay. And it went down that way because the far left turned up looking for violence, as usual. And they got it, and they came off for worse, and they had to go back to Nottingham skulking with their tail between their legs. And nowhere were they having any effect against the BNP across the entire country. Probably some minor success, isolated once in a while, but the vast majority of incidents, they were getting beaten quite badly. And so, you know, they took to their policy of hiding behind police lines. And in fact, they tried to hide behind police lines that night as well. And if it hadn't been for the police intervening in large numbers, yeah, well, you know, it would have made the national press, let alone all over the local and regional press. But, you know, quite frankly, we scored 6.7% of the vote. A lot of the local BNP activists said, you know, that was your fault, you should have stopped it. We were looking to get at least 20% of the vote. Well, it wasn't my fault at all in actual fact, and I don't accept responsibility for it to this day. Yes, I was a senior BNP political officer on the ground until Richard Edmonds turned up, but that is completely immaterial because, you know, the local men, there was an animus, you know, there was a steamroller of energy driving that battle. It was definitely going to happen. Nothing I could have said to them that would have made the slightest bit of difference. They would have just ignored me and gone in anyway. And so that's the way it worked out. And that was quite commonplace in actual fact across the country. I mean, what particularly annoyed me about Richard Edmonds that day, and this is where I started to disobey orders from the leadership in London. Because, you know, I remembered the Battle of Bermondsey, which was on a much larger scale than the Battle of Copmanay in actual fact. Very, very similar scenario. And Richard Edmonds and his crowd were involved in that. You know, Eddie Butler, all of them, Tony Lacombe in London, the whole London crowd. So good for them to do it, but not here in Derbyshire. You know, we weren't allowed to do it according to them. Nonsense. You see, and this was where a schism was already taking place in the BNP under the Tyndall years, because everything was London-centric, and we had completely had enough of this London-centrism, quite frankly. And out in the regions, you know, there was serious talk of basically branches just breaking away from head office and forming their own organisations. You know, it never reached a serious pitch, where there was a possibility of happening, but the talk, the chatter became louder and more widespread with every passing month. So we were trying to make the London centric BNP lot understand that we've had enough of taking orders from London. We've had enough of our money going to London, and the money I raised here, not one penny of it was ever sent to London. It stayed here in a Midlands bank account. Okay, it was later frittered away by that idiot Keith Axon, and I'm not going to refer to Keith Axon as anything other than an idiot, because that's exactly what the man is, And his heritage and destiny routine today, well, my goodness. Yes, well, I can understand them talking about the heritage side of things and daydreaming in his bedroom, which is all Axon was ever good at, quite frankly. But his destiny is the one it was always destined to be, failure, because the man is incompetent. And this is a point I'd like to make about one of the reasons why the BNP fell. I always refer to the BNP as BNP 1 and BNP 2, because BNP 1 was under John Tyndall's leadership and BNP 2 was under Nick Griffin's leadership. And so BNP 1 didn't fail, it didn't fall apart, it ground to a halt after the big schism with the NS in 1994, in which the NS lot went away and eventually joined forces with Blood and Honour and Screwdriver, etc., just so they could take over the proceeds from the skinhead music market. And I didn't want anything to do with Blood and Honour, and certainly not the British movement. Absolutely not. They were far too extreme, particularly the British movement. I wanted nothing to do with them at all. In actual fact, this is another thing. John Tyndall made this perfectly clear to me in 1991, 1992. He banned anyone in the BNP from holding dual membership of the British National Party and the British movement, and also laid down a very clear instruction that no one in the BNP or onto BNP activity was ever allowed to wear National Socialist paraphernalia of any description. Anyone doing so had to remove it, or they would be removed from the activity. And so, these are very valid points to make, because you have all of these clowns like Tommy Robinson to this day saying, oh, the British National Party was openly National Socialist. The British National Party was never openly National Socialist at all. It never adopted such a policy, and it most definitely never adopted fascism either. It only ever declared itself to be nationalist. Okay? There being a big difference between nationalism, fascism, and particularly National Socialism, which is the most hardcore of the lot. I didn't want anything to do with National Socialism or fascism. I regarded myself as a nationalist. The modern term that people use now is ethno-nationalist, and they've started using this so as to differentiate themselves from these idiotic civic nationalists. Well, I don't see the need to do that. I don't really go around calling myself an ethno-nationalist. Occasionally people would ask me for a definition. I would say, well, I veer more towards what you would know as ethno-nationalism. But I regard myself as being a nationalist. Civic nationalists are idiots, quite frankly. Civic nationalism is nonsense. It doesn't exist. There can never be such a thing as civic nationalism. In actual fact, it's just a leftist offshoot, a little bit like the SNP in Scotland, or the Catalan nationalists, leftists, quite frankly. Yes, you can get left-wing nationalism, imitation nationalism, that is. And so that was a point that I wanted to get across, that the British National Party was never openly National Socialist or fascist, and forget the nonsense spouted by Searchlight magazine, that fairy tale and fantasy rag, or Hope Not Hate to this day. And that's a very valid point to make as well, because we have Matt Collins, Hope Not Hate, and that intriguing little docudrama they made called The Walk-In on ITV, in which he described himself in the university lectures as a former leading light in the far right. Well, he was nothing of the sort in actual fact. He was a foot soldier in the NF. Nobody took him seriously. He held no position. He wasn't even a branch organiser. He was just a low-level snitch and spy who Jerry Gables, or Jerry Fables, got his hands on and converted him, corrupted him, quite frankly, for want of a better description. Then, of course, he handed him over to Special Branch to milk him dry. And then eventually, because it all went tits up for them, because he was meddling in C-18 business, and they most definitely would have sanctioned him very severely for that, they sent him off to Australia. And then some years later, he came back. And now he's, well, suddenly transformed himself from being NF foot soldier, low-ranking NF foot soldier, into a leading light in the far right. And that's the problem with most of these people. They live in a dream world. I encounter people on a fairly frequent basis who claim that they were involved in the BNP during the so-called glory years. And it's still known as that to this day. You might not realise that. And some people might not like it. Even the Griffinites, in actual fact, might not like it. But some people do still refer to the BNP glory years as basically 91, 94. The days of direct action when the left were stopped by force across the entire country, you know. And it was a pivotal experience, quite frankly. And it's one that endures to this day. I guess that's why people call it the glory years. But some people to this day claim, oh yeah, I was involved in this and I was involved in that. And then people ask me, do you remember this guy? And I'm like, I never knew him, never met him. Who is he? You know, everybody seems to want to be part of the action, as it were, quite frankly. But, you know, as much as direct action had to be used to stop the far left's direct action, ultimately what it did was disenfranchise the public. So, you know, at the ballot box, that is. And so ultimately the far left's policy was successful to a certain extent, wasn't it? Because whilst we were bogged down in direct action battles with the far left, you know, it was giving us a very bad name by the mainstream media. I mean, they were never going to write anything good about us anyway. And even if we had not have been involved in these direct action battles with the far left, you can be in absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the press would never have printed a nice, decent, honest thing about the British National Party. And the reason why? Because we were anti-establishment. We're not like Nigel Farage and his deep fake reform today, who are talked up incessantly around the clock, providing, of course, he sticks to the centrist line that they've set out for him. And if he deviates from him, then obviously they bring him back into line with public lambasting him. And, of course, the BNP had no one supporting it. No one in the media supported the British National Party. They were all dead set against us. All senior police officers were dead set against us. The so-called intelligence services, they're despicable criminals in Special Branch. And I'll say this about Special Branch, because, you know, my introduction to the BNP came as a result of Special Branch. You know, I met Special Branch officers at Ilkeston Police Station on the 24th of January 1990. One DC Frank Bailey, according to them, and another one called Alan. And they wanted to recruit me as an informant, which I absolutely refused. And they said that if I ever breathed a word about what happened that night, I'd end up dead. Not of natural causes, obviously, you know. Not of natural causes, as a result of Special Branch, that is. So all I can say about Special Branch is this, yeah. You know, no Special Branch officer will ever go to heaven while there's room for one more in hell. And quite frankly, there's a lot of room in hell for Special Branch officers. Okay? If you need a criminal behaviour order, go and get one. It's of no concern to me. I will not comply with it. Got it? Right, let's get back to the real business. So Special Branch were infiltrating the BNP. They'd infiltrated all right-wing and left-wing organisations, and they were organising the violence against each other. That is a proven fact. You can look at the book Undercover, you know, written by the Guardian Lovies, in actual fact. Lovies they may well be, but at the end of the day, Undercover is a very accurate story of Britain's spy cops, the Special Demonstration Squad, Metropolitan Police Special Branch. And all Special Branch units across the country, obviously, were subordinate to them and working with them cap in glove. So Special Branch, no, never trust a Special Branch officer with the time of day. As Jada Franson explained, you know, in the podcast we did with Mark Heath some weeks ago, Tommy Robinson had his own special branch handler called Dave. Amazing how they're all called Dave, isn't it? Or is that just the south of England? But anyway, joking aside, Dave, it's like this. Special branch had an objective: to destroy all right-wing and left-wing groups that posed a threat to the status quo in a so-called democracy. This is not a democracy, it is an elective dictatorship propped up with instruments of tyranny passed through Parliament, inflicted on us by the courts. Okay? Anyone who doesn't like that, that's not a problem. I don't care. It's called freedom of expression. Of course, that doesn't exist in Britain either, does it? A fact we know only too well. And I don't care about the hate speech tyrants either. I will continue. I will press my points without fear or favour. And so let's get back to that point. Special branch. So eventually, I was invited to attend head office, which was the bookshop. It was our HQ, but it was a bookshop ostensibly, a heavily fortified bookshop, I might add, because of the far left, at Welling in Kent, and so I went there in November 1993 after the big battle in which thousands of Red had rioted and battled with the Met Police, which was very entertaining for us in actual fact, because we just sat back with the popcorn, as it were, and watched the entertainment. As two groups of our enemies basically beat each other to a pulp. What's not to like? That's what we said about it. Very, very amusing, very entertaining. I found it very entertaining, I must admit. Still do to this day, for the record. Okay? And so I went to the BNP HQ and was greeted there by, it was the BNP's AGM, I might add, the annual general meeting. And the lead speaker obviously was John Tyndall, of course, as ever. And once you'd heard one of his speeches, you'd heard all of them, because all of his speeches were the same. Although he was a very fiery, passionate, very impressive speaker the first 2 or 3 times that you heard him. And then, of course, you knew exactly what was coming, and it was like, okay, change the script a little bit, why don't you? But, of course, that's something else he wouldn't do because of his autocratic style of leadership. And so, yeah, there I met Jim White, or James White, Jim White, the so-called customs officer, and his sidekick, one Arthur Flinders, a rather large, overweight man, and very friendly, very personable, very charming in actual fact, and very fake with it, I might add. And I was dressed in a 3-piece grey suit, I remember it vividly in actual fact, with a crisp white shirt. I didn't bother with a tie on that occasion. I didn't like ties in actual fact. I'd spent years wearing ties and decided no tie, so as not to be tied to anyone or anything, certainly not convention or expectation. And so they said, Mr. Tyndall has asked that you do a special job for us today. And I said, really? At first I was kind of flattered, I guess, really. Mr. Tyndall's asked me to do a special job for him, has he? Bearing in mind I was still a Tyndall loyalist at that time, even after the fracas in April 1993 on the big anti-IRA demonstration in the West End, which ended with an awful lot of division in the BNP because of the stunt Tyndall pulled that day. I still remained loyal to him. And remember I said earlier, I'm not here to denigrate and denounce John Tyndall. I'm here to tell the truth about him as I saw it, as I experienced it. And so really I thought, well, okay, I'll carry out this special favour for Mr. Tyndall. And so the special favour consisted of taking 2 Americans who'd been sent over by David Duke as emissaries, in actual fact, to the BNP. And I was to chaperone them to a number of RV points and then take them to the AGM. Only I could be trusted to do it, apparently, which made me very suspicious, in actual fact. So off we went to the first RV point. And then phoned into head office, spoke to Flinders, and Flinders gave us another RV point. So we went to that RV point. And then we phoned into head office again. And this was completely not the norm, in actual fact. 2 or 3 RV points was the norm, but not as many as what we experienced that day. And then I got to speak to Jim White, And he gave me another RV point. And the Americans by this time were grumbling, my goodness, how much longer is this going on? We seem to be travelling all the way around London on buses and also on the tube. And so by the time I think we got to the seventh RV point, I phoned him and I spoke to Flinders. And I said to him, look, let's just cut the crap, shall we, basically. This is a runaround game. I'm coming back to head office right now to find out exactly why you have given us the runaround game, because the AGM started an hour ago. These very important American emissaries sent here by David Duke are never going to get to that meeting, yeah? And obviously the BNP is not going to get the donation, sizable donation, it was being promised. So I need to flesh this out. And so I went back to the HQ full of fire, really fired up, hell-bent on having it out with Flinders and Jim White. And of course, en route to the head office, I convinced Don. Dean was a very simple, naive guy. In actual fact, it was like dealing with a child, in actual fact. I didn't really spend much time on him. And he said, I'm perfectly sure that's not true, this is not some sort of setup. I say, guarantee you this most definitely is a setup. You have been deliberately denied access to the BNP AGM today, and so have I, and I'm really annoyed about it. Now, Don was far more clued up, he was worldly wise, and he was subtle, and he was experienced, and he said, I'll go with you every time, Simon. Just tell it the way it is. Tell us what you really think's happened. And I told him, and he said, well, I'll go with you. And I said to him, I said, whatever sum of money you're planning to give the BNP, you must not under any circumstances send that money here, because that's going to end up in the hands of Special Branch and Searchlight Magazine, misused, misdirected. And they asked me why, and I explained to them exactly why. And I said that I believe Jim White and Arthur Flinders were either working for Special Branch or Searchlight Magazine, and we've been deliberately given the runaround game that day to ensure they didn't get to the AGM, I didn't get to the AGM, and the BNP didn't get the money either. It was $100,000 as it turned out, in actual fact. And that's exactly the way it happened. They didn't get to the AGM. I didn't get to the AGM. And the BNP didn't get the $100,000 from David Duke either, And yeah, I was absolutely furious. So when I got back to the BNP's head office, Flinders was hiding upstairs in the back room. Wouldn't even come down to see me, to confront me, which I regard as a very cowardly stunt in actual fact. Dishonest and cowardly. And told me everything I needed to know about Arthur Flinders, quite frankly. Or Big Arth, as they called him. And Jim White, of course, the Scotsman, stood his ground. And we had a furious argument. And, we left it at that, quite frankly. And I was absolutely convinced that both Jim White and Arthur Flinders were working for the enemy. That they were, in actual fact, the enemy. And one thing I'd always been taught was the enemy could be anywhere and it could be anyone. And quite frankly, Jim White and Arthur Flinders stopped the British National Party that day from getting a £100,000 donation when it was sorely needed, in actual fact, from David Duke in the United States. And that runaround game was purely to ensure the two Americans, Dean and Don, did not get to the AGM to see John Tyndall in action and then meet with him and speak with him later. And Tyndall didn't get that money. In fact, it took another couple of years before the money came through, and that all went down the drain, apart from the lion's share which Tyndall had for himself, obviously. I'd left the BNP by then. I'd been gone a few months, fortunately, quite frankly. But that day was a defining moment for me, because it was when I ceased to be a Tyndall loyalist. I also ceased to be a committed BNP activist. I was no longer a believer. I guess if you looked at it in the sense of Jean le Carré, and his famous novels about the fanatic, always has an inner doubt, it's true. In all the years I was in the BNP, I harboured that inner doubt. Was I doing the right thing? Is this the right thing? I asked myself that question. I had to reaffirm that status that it was the right thing over and over and over again. And then when that incident happened, despite all the other horrible incidents that had gone before it against the far left, when that incident happened, I basically, I had to ask myself, having raised the matter with Tyndall and told them that these two men were infiltrators and they needed to be expelled from BNP HQ. And his response to it was, it's hard enough to recruit people as volunteers at the bookshop as it is. And, you know, so I'm not going to get rid of them. I trust them. I trust them. Just stopped him from getting a $100,000 donation from David Duke, and he continued to trust them, which meant he didn't trust me, quite frankly, you know. And that was the end. That was the end game. I went to a pub later, you know, in Holborn, after the AGM, and in came Tyndall with all the fawning, boot-licking, arse-licking grovellers as usual. Sorry to be crude, but that's just the way it is, you know. I am just a ground worker after all, aren't I? Never forget that, you know. I'm just a ground worker. And yes, I was sickened by what I saw, and I walked out of the pub and threw my BNP badge into the gutter. It was raining. I climbed into a taxi and went to Lewisham, and en route I formulated a plan of how to deal with Arthur Flinders. He'd invited us to stay the night at his place, a flat in Lewisham. And yeah, I went to the shop, and you know, I'd got quite a bit of money at that time, in actual fact, you know. And I thought, okay, I'll go and get a couple of bottles of Glenfiddich. That should loosen their tongues admirably. And so that's exactly what I did. I went down to the shop, I got a couple of bottles of Glenfiddich, and which was my favourite whiskey at that time. And sadly, I can't drink now because of Crohn's disease. But yeah, Dean opened up like the fool I expected him to be. Dom was far more sombre and astute and perceptive. And Arthur Flinders held himself together like a professional, because that's exactly what he was trained to do under the influence of alcohol, you know. And I sat back and watched it all unfold. I said nothing, did nothing in actual fact. I simply went home armed with the knowledge. And that knowledge was, it's time for me to leave the BNP. But I know too much. And leaving suddenly would raise serious suspicions in many quarters. And so I had to work out a plan, you know, and the plan was, I need to do this slowly and surely, deliberately, and that's what I did. And so, in essence, this is where part one comes to an end in this documentary, because part two will cover the the rest of what I experienced in the BNP and how it was eventually collapsed and why it's never coming back. And but that moment, the reason why, you know, I didn't leave overnight, the reason why it destroyed my faith in Tyndall and the BNP and the cause, well, how on earth can you be a member of a political party when it's operationally compromised at the highest level? It's just impossible. There was no way I was going to continue in the BNP once I realised how deeply infiltrated and compromised it was. And everything I was doing at a local level, catching infiltrators, and I did catch several of them in actual fact, and removed them as well. I had to play some very, you know, dark games to do it, but that's the way it is. And Tyndall was just allowing these people to stay in place. And I thought to myself, there's no wonder the national press practically every month has a story supplied by an infiltrator at BNP HQ. And then I asked myself, maybe Tyndall's leaving them in situ because they've got something on him. And then I started thinking to myself, what might they have on him? What have they got on him? And once you start thinking like that, it's all over. And so part one of this documentary ends at this point, and in part two we'll go into the reason why I actually left the BNP, when I did it, how I did it, and then why I went back, how I went back, and how I left again, and then how the BNP totally and utterly destroyed itself, all by design, not by accident, I promise you. You know, this is the rise and fall of the British National Party. This part is about the rise of the BNP. The fall, or the hard fall, comes later. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.